All right, welcome to our last J Chat of the year and before our summer break. So please welcome our speaker, Stephanie, and she's going to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her background and dive into her fascinating topic.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be able to speak to a bunch of young people who are excited about birding. My name is Steffanie Munguía, and I am the Avian Conservation Programs Manager at ZooMiami, which essentially means that I oversee all of our zoo's work to make sure that we are protecting thriving wild populations of birds, both in our backyard in South Florida, as well as all across the hemisphere and around the world, wherever we can be involved in projects for bird conservation, wherever they may need us. So with that, I'll go ahead and share my screen and we'll launch right into talking about beyond the zoo, the role of zoos in bird conservation. So let me tell you a little bit more about my journey into this work, because I think some of it will hopefully resonate with some of you, and some of it might inspire you to think differently about your career paths as people who are passionate about birds and ecology. So my journey really began in my childhood adventures. I was born in Puerto Rico. My mother is also Puerto Rican, and my dad is from Cuba. And I was very fortunate that my dad was and is still today an all-around naturalist, but he was particularly interested in herpetology and ornithology, so reptiles, amphibians, and birds. And we kind of have a running gag in our family that we sort of made our way up the evolutionary ladder and started with amphibians, got really interested in reptiles, and then we're like, whoa, have you heard of birds? And realized they were pretty fantastic. Thankfully, his passion and enthusiasm for being outdoors rubbed off on my mother, who was a chemistry student and ended up becoming a full-time educator. And with the combination of the two of them, having somebody who was so excited about nature and ecosystems and someone who was very passionate about education, what ended up coming out of that was someone who was equally excited about both of those things and trying to figure out how can we combine them. Thankfully, they took me out into the outdoors every opportunity they got. There's a lot of stories about me being only several months old, strapped into a little baby carrier, exploring El Yunque, which is where that photo you can see there of the three of us was taken. So a lot of my enthusiasm for ecology and for conservation really got its start in those early childhood experiences. And I recognize that's an incredibly privileged thing that I got to do, to have two people in my life who were so supportive of letting their daughter just traipse around in the muck outdoors. But that's where I began, and really glad to be able to share that with people. That eventually transformed into a sense that not many of my peers had similar experiences. And when I got to middle school, I realized that it was time for me to start giving back in a variety of different ways. That's actually when I found organizations like Audubon and was introduced to their work through places like the Center for Birds of Prey, but also found organizations right in my backyard, in my community, that were hungry for young people to bring their energy into the outdoors and to really help them think about how we could engage more young people. So I got involved in a lot of volunteering projects through that. And you can see me there in the picture wearing a rain jacket in chest high water, which was very smart, obviously, but these are the kinds of things one does when you are still learning about what you're trying to do. And we were removing water hyacinth in a marsh in Polk County, where I ended up spending most of my childhood. And through this process, I came to learn that while it was a little bit weird to be that kid who liked spending time outdoors and with my parents, it turned out there were other weird kids too. So hopefully, as members of a Young Birders Club, you've found that community for yourself too, and are learning how to be there for each other and support each other. And that wildlife volunteering really helped me to expand my network. Like I said, I got to know people at Audubon. I got to meet people in a variety of different conservation organizations and nature centers across the state, and started to understand more and more what it took to build a movement of people who were just as passionate about conservation as I was. And that really inspired me to pursue higher education in conservation. And that began with studying ecology and conservation biology, but took me to really interesting places as I continue to learn more and more about how limited nature access is for a lot of people around the country for different reasons, whether it's lack of access due to lack of wealth, or maybe you're a member of a marginalized group that doesn't have as many opportunities or may not feel safe engaging in these outdoor activities. So I became more and more involved in advocacy and outreach as I progressed through my career. Even though I started my undergrad as an animal biology major, I ended up adding an environmental policy major as well, because I realized that it wasn't enough to be really passionate about animals, to want to get to observe birds in the wild all the time. I also had to speak up for them and make sure that they were getting what they needed. And what that ended up leading to was a master's degree and even a PhD that were both more focused on policy and trying to understand how do we create the structures and systems that birds and people need to be able to ensure that we have a healthy environment for all of us. That said, after finishing my PhD, it became pretty clear to me that I was missing that time out in the field. And I often think about what, 5-year-old Steffanie would have thought of the life I was building. And 5-year-old Steffanie would have wanted me to be handling birds more often, I think, which is definitely an understandable dream at 5. But I was struggling to figure out how to balance my 5-year-old desires to handle birds with my very grown-up concerns about birds losing their habitat and not having the things that they need to thrive. So that's where I really became more passionate about field conservation. And just in the last few months, to be totally transparent, as of December, was able to transition my career back into something that I think is more aligned with what both 5-year-old Steffanie and now 30-year-old Steffanie are really excited about, which is getting to design these research projects and conservation projects with the explicit goal of making sure that it's not just about observing and handling birds, but about making sure that they have what they need and the people to support them to continue thriving. And that's what brought me to my job at ZooMiami. So let's talk a little bit about what's in a zoo, because I think certainly for myself, there was a lot that I did not fully understand about zoos before I first worked in a zoo a few years ago. And I think most of us think of the collection animals when we think of a zoo, right? You might imagine or remember going to your local zoo, walking around, seeing all the animals on their habitats, or what probably the average person in the public would just call their enclosures. We like to call them habitats because they are living out there ideally as wildly as we can provide for them. So that's the collection. And that is a critically important part of a zoo's mission, because not only is the collection there to provide educational opportunities for the public, they're also there to help conserve their species through participating in breeding programs that are tightly coordinated by the Association for Zoos and Aquaria. And that's what zoos for a very long time had focused on, was just making sure that if we do have animals in our collections, let's make sure that they're also participating in conservation breeding programs, that we're managing that captive population to be genetically stable, so we don't have to take animals out of the wild to have them in a zoo. However, that is just a very, very small part of what zoos do, because what the public often doesn't see when you go to a zoo is that zoos are also charged with investing in conservation through a variety of different means, and that can look really different for different zoos depending on what resources they have access to. But this combination of our collection and investing in conservation is what leads to our participation in what we would call SAFE programs. And SAFE stands for Saving Animals from Extinction. And the idea is that by not only focusing on managing our captive populations well, but also making sure that we're investing in conservation through our own research and conservation programs, as well as by investing in conservation organizations on the ground who are doing critically important work to save those species, that we are actually saving animals from extinction. Because if you do the math, just keeping a bunch of cool animals in a zoo without actually protecting their habitat out in the wild doesn't help save that species from extinction. It just slows it down a little bit. So we want to make sure we're taking a more holistic approach. So at ZooMiami, our mission is to inspire people through engaging experiences to preserve nature in South Florida and across the globe. And that's the mission that I'm now tasked with, really stewarding as the Avian Conservation Programs Manager. That can take a lot of forms. It means building more engaging interactive exhibits for people to come and learn about the connections between their daily lives and some of these animals in the wild. But it also means that we have dedicated staff, like my conservation and research team that I'm a member of, that focus specifically on how can we better achieve the conservation part of our mission, and how do we contribute to research that helps to protect these species in the wild. So our conservation and research department works to support partners that are working to conserve wildlife around the globe, from butterflies to elephants, quite literally. We also collaborate with keepers to increase our conservation impact. And we try to design research projects that fill critical gaps in our knowledge about the conservation needs of different species. So I want to share with you all a few examples of how we do those three things. So the first one is supporting our partners, and I want to share with you the story of the red siskin, or cardenalito, which is a critically endangered bird in Venezuela. It's extremely range restricted. They recently found, just a few years ago, a pretty large population in Guyana, but the population in Venezuela, unfortunately, is not doing very well, is severely reduced. And a big part of that is that they were actually poached for the captive bird trade. And probably not in the way you're thinking. Actually, it turns out red siskins carry a genetic marker that when it is passed on through interbreeding with like a standard yellow canary, gives you a red canary. So anytime you've seen a red canary in a pet shop, somewhere in its ancestral line was a red siskin that was probably taken from the wild in Venezuela. So this is a bird that we're very passionate about. It is a bird that we also have in our collection, and one that I now get to work with our partners in Venezuela to help to supplement their funding for a conservation breeding program that they have on the ground, where they take some of these birds that have been confiscated from poachers and put them to breed in captivity, with the eventual goal of being able to return their fledglings to the wild, so that they can reestablish healthy wild populations. So we're really collaborating on that conservation breeding program, not only with their work on the ground, but we also help at ZooMiami to sustain and manage a captive population here in the United States through genetically managing the birds that are at different institutions like ZooMiami, the Smithsonian Institution, and several other zoos that now have these in their collection too. The other thing that we do with this bird in particular, because in Miami we have a large population of Venezuelan immigrants, we also try to facilitate more international outreach and think of creative ways to engage our local Venezuelan community in becoming passionate advocates for this bird back home. So that takes a lot of different forms, and it's something that I'm currently developing, but a few of the ideas that we've had are using a children's storybook that our partners, Red Siskin Initiative in Venezuela, have created and developed to reach school children in the predominantly Venezuelan community here in Miami. We're also definitely encouraging our zoo and other businesses in the area to stock bird-friendly coffee, because that is a great initiative that helps to make sure that we're protecting habitat throughout much of the Central and South American range of a lot of the songbirds that we know and love here in our backyards when they migrate back from their wintering grounds down south. So that's how we're supporting our partners. We also collaborate with keepers, and I want to share with you the story of the harpy eagle, because this is one of the kind of flagship species for ZooMiami. We're one of the only zoological institutions in the United States that has harpy eagles. And a big part of that was due to Ron McGill, who you can see in the photo there on the bottom, and his particular passion for this bird when he was first introduced to this bird. And he became, in fact, so infatuated with harpy eagles that he truly became a champion for them, not only here in Miami, but back in Panama. And it is in part thanks to his work, bringing together researchers, rehabilitators, all sorts of different stakeholders in Panama to advocate with the Panamanian government that the harpy eagle is now the state bird, or the national bird of Panama. So we keep up this relationship by having keeper exchanges, where some of our keepers in Miami will go to Panama to visit the harpy eagles that are kept at the Summit Park and Gardens in Panama City. We also offer veterinary consults if they need additional support or resources. We've, of course, participated in animal transfers and releases through this program as well. And in particular, the bird that is actually currently at the Summit Park and Gardens in Panama was born in ZooMiami. She was actually one of our pair's first chicks, and she ended up traveling back to her native land to serve as an ambassador animal there. And the other big thing we do is continue to support conservation in country. Just in the last few weeks, I've had several wonderful conversations with people from Summit Gardens, as well as rehabilitation centers and the biologists who work on harpy eagles to understand how the zoo can continue to invest in and support their conservation efforts on the ground. Harpies are an incredibly magnificent bird, and I feel really fortunate that my office is right next to our harpy eagle habitat, and I get to go visit them on my lunch break and see what they're up to as they're currently taking care of an egg, which is very exciting. And another thing that we do is design research specifically to answer critical questions for conservation of species. A lot of this work we do by studying our local species to understand trends, and ZooMiami has been very involved in the Florida Flamingo project, which is working with researchers from a variety of different groups, from water management districts to state biological agencies and beyond, to deepen our knowledge about the flamingos that are now being seen all across the state of Florida. And of course, this was part of their historic range, but for a long time, we didn't have flamingos in large numbers, and now we have pretty large thriving flocks in several different parts of the state. So we're working with researchers to study their behavior, to figure out their movement patterns, to make sure that we understand whether these are truly just accidental storm transplants, or if they're becoming an established population here, and to figure out the most important piece of becoming an established population: are they breeding somewhere in Florida? And if so, where and how successfully? So this helps us to really apply this research to a real world problem of whether or not flamingos are returning to their historic range. And what does that mean for big questions like Everglades restoration? What does a flamingo need that might be different from Cape Sable seaside sparrow, for example, that might cohabitate in that similar range that they might both need, but they're going to have very different hydrological needs as well. So understanding what the bird needs to establish itself and what it needs from us specifically is a critical part of our research on Florida flamingos. And of course, it doesn't stop with just doing the research. We also advocate for these birds. And some of you may have heard that there is a bill moving through the Florida State House and Senate to make the flamingo the Florida state bird, and to designate the scrub jay as the Florida state songbird. I'm happy to talk about that more too. But really helping to raise the profile of this species and the recovery that we're now seeing. So I want to share with you a little bit more about my own projects in my role and how they kind of fit into these different initiatives that our conservation and research department participates in. So one of the first ones is studying the white-crowned pigeon. This is probably a bird that not many of you have given a lot of thought to, especially if you're up in Central Florida and you're quite out of their range. But the white-crowned pigeon is actually a relatively common bird. I've seen them in Puerto Rico. They're found all throughout the Caribbean, and their northernmost extent of their range is here in South Florida. For many, many years, the prevailing wisdom has been that white-crowned pigeons would nest in the Florida Keys, and then they would disperse for the winter to go to either Cuba or the Bahamas for their wintering grounds. Now, there's some really interesting challenges in both of those places, in the sense that in the Bahamas, hunting is legal for the white-crowned pigeon. So there had been some concern that our populations would fly over to the Bahamas and potentially lose a large percentage of their population in the Bahamas that would not be able to return, which is a real challenge for sustainably managing a population that moves across borders, right? However, some researchers, myself included, have started to suspect that that behavior might be shifting. And of course, we can't say that it's because of hunting pressure. We don't know that yet. We don't even know if this is actually the case, that this behavior is shifting, but we have documented on a couple of different occasions young birds in places that they shouldn't necessarily be if they were truly breeding exclusively in the Keys and in the furthest south extent of Everglades National Park. They're starting to be seen more and more as fledglings in more central and northern Miami-Dade County, which doesn't really make sense with their dispersal patterns. So we're trying to figure out if maybe they're breeding in new places. And we're also increasingly seeing white crown pigeons year-round in Miami-Dade County, which might indicate that not as much of the population is migrating as they used to places like the Bahamas and Cuba. And there could be a lot of different reasons for that. It could be because of that hunting pressure I mentioned. It could also be because Miami-Dade County has invested a lot of money over the last decade or so in restoring tropical hardwood hammock habitat, which is the type of habitat that they need to forage and find the food that they need. So my research project is going to be investigating some of these shifts on Key Biscayne, which seems like it could be a viable breeding location. We've seen young white crown pigeons there at times of year that they shouldn't necessarily have reached there by. And we do also see them throughout the winter months. So hopefully by getting to study these birds in this habitat, we'll get a better understanding of how their behavior might be shifting in a changing world. Another project that I'm currently involved in is monitoring our pine rockland ecosystem, which in South Florida, pine rockland is one of the most, probably the most critically endangered ecosystem type. It used to be found all along the Atlantic coastal ridge in South Florida, but much like the longleaf pine ecosystems in central and northern Florida, a lot of those pines were cut down for building, and unfortunately now there's less than 2% of its historic range throughout Miami-Dade County. ZooMiami happens to sit in the middle of one of the largest remaining tracts of pine rockland outside of Everglades National Park. And we have a lot of research programs investigating the species that use this habitat, like gopher tortoises. And now, in my case, because I'm on board, also investigating the birds that use this system. I'm doing this through a combination of point counts and hopefully in the future being able to do some banding out there as well to see how individuals return to this site year after year. I've just wrapped up our yellow rumped warbler season. I think most of them are headed north, but they were just here until last week. And really excited to see how our populations shift throughout the year through different seasons and as birds use the habitat in different ways. And finally, my last project is a collaboration with the Cape Florida Banding Station, which is the longest running southernmost banding station in the continental US. And really my role here is just continue that operation. They've been banding out there for 23 years now, 22 years, studying neotropical migratory birds in South Florida. So the zoo is now able to help support that project through my own staff time and also by providing additional support to make sure that not only are we collecting these data, but we're also publishing it in ways that it can be shared with the scientific community and really contribute to bird conservation. Lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about how to get more involved, especially if you're interested in zoo work in the future or you think it might be of interest. And more broadly, if you're interested in ornithology, ecology, any of those. The first thing I would say is to invest in yourself. And that can take a lot of different forms, and you don't have to wait until you get to college to start doing those things. As I shared at the beginning, I started to get really involved as a volunteer when I was in middle school, and that carried me all through high school. And that was incredibly helpful for me to get a better sense of what the landscape was of ecology in Florida, what were the kinds of opportunities out there, and for me personally to know where I might fit in all of that. There's lots of different ways that you could pursue a passion for bird conservation. You can be a field researcher, you could become a geneticist, you could do any number of different things. And by volunteering, I was able to be exposed to a lot of these different opportunities and not only, shorten the list of things that I was really excited about doing, it also helped me rule out things that, while cool, were just clearly not my thing, which is how I ended up not becoming a geneticist. And of course, volunteering is really cool, but it is something that can be difficult to access if you don't have transportation, if you don't have the resources or ability to volunteer your time, and that's okay. And for that reason, I definitely encourage you to look for internships, especially if you can find a compensated internship, that's fantastic. But if you do an unpaid internship, even just having the word internship behind that experience makes it seem so much more professional and official. It makes you much more competitive when you can put an internship on your resume. The other thing I would advise is to look for outreach programs. Look in your community for different opportunities for community members to become involved. For example, bio blitzes are hosted quite frequently all over the state by different organizations. These are really cool ways to get involved in contributing to science, but also getting to meet other people. Many of them might be scientists themselves. Many of them might just be your neighbors who you never knew had a similar interest in being in the outdoors and studying nature. So it's a great way to continue to build your network and to build some of your scientific skills as well. I wanted to share one example that we had at the zoo before my time. There were sacred ibises that made it out into the wild many years ago, and ZooMiami actually played a really important role in researching their movements and helping to remove them from the wild. Unfortunately, they just don't belong in South Florida, but they were spreading very rapidly, and the zoo felt like it was a good opportunity for us to engage the community in talking about invasive species, putting tags on these birds and trying to figure out where they were flocking so that we can more effectively remove them from the wild here in South Florida. And we had people who would see one of our birds with the tags and could call in and report it. And actually right now there's a study going on in Palm Beach County with white ibises where the researcher is studying their behavior in urban environments. And she has sort of similarly put tags like these on the birds and is asking people to call anytime they see one of her birds in an urban environment. So those outreach programs are really great ways to connect with researchers and to connect with other people in your community about conservation. Another thing is to find creative ways to contribute. I feel very often that when I talk to young people, they have so many different passions. And the biggest struggle is figuring out how you make time for all of those. And believe me, I get it. I was a choir and theater kid in high school. It was very, very confusing to figure out how to schedule my rehearsal time with my volunteering time and how to reconcile these like two seemingly very different people who lived within me. And I think the biggest mistake that I made was that I didn't really get very creative about how I could combine those different skills. So I would just encourage you, if you are an artist, if you do something that you feel like is uniquely you, maybe even a little bit strange, find ways that you can integrate that into your conservation work. There are really cool collaborations that emerge from scientists and artists working together. Right now, actually at ZooMiami, we have a great story with painted dogs. We've collaborated with a painted dog conservation organization for many, many years. And this year we are actually helping to fill a shipping container with supplies that they need to build their research center on the ground. And the shipping container, we actually collaborated with a local artist to get it painted. So now not only is it, a useful tool that's going to be filled up with supplies that they really need out there. It's also an artistic installation that we have sitting in our parking lot while we wait for zoos all across the country to ship us their supplies to put in that container before we ship it overseas to Africa. So there are always different ways. If you end up finding that like a career in science, being a full-time scientist is not for you, but you still really love photography or painting or illustration, or even songwriting, there are ways that you can contribute to the conservation movement using those skills too. And the last advice I would give is definitely to talk to people. I know this is possibly the most nerve-wracking thing, and maybe when we get to Q&A, you can challenge yourself to try talking to me. It is a little scary, and I will admit it's something that I've worked for a really long time to cultivate being more comfortable doing it, but it is so worth it. Most of the time we get so in our heads about what the other person is thinking about us that we forget to just put ourselves out there. And most of the great opportunities I've had in my life have come from just putting myself out there, from taking a chance, being a little concerned that maybe I'll say something that makes me seem a little bit silly. And 99% of the time it is not a problem. And people are just thrilled that you're reaching out, especially if you're a young person and you like look up to somebody's work, tell them that. They love to hear that. And they really want to know that you're interested in, maybe following in their footsteps and learning from them. So don't be afraid to network, even though I think some people think of that as kind of an ugly word that no one's very excited about doing. It's just getting to know new people. And it's a great opportunity and a great place to kind of live your life from, a good perspective to think of everybody as a friend you just haven't met yet. So with that, I would love to take any questions that you all have, and I'll just leave this slide up there in part because I think this spoonbill is adorable, but also because you have my contact information there as well, if you would like to reach out or keep in touch.
Okay, and I've opened it up that you can unmute yourself now. And if you want to show your face, you can turn your video on if you want to.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Steffanie, for the excellent examples and just your sharing your personal story with our young birders. And we have two of them with us, Nell and Reagan. And as Steffanie said, Nell and Reagan, now's your chance to ask her anything and everything.
Yeah, go for it now.
What species of pine is in the pine rockland?
Yeah, great question. So it's actually a local subspecies of the slash pine. It's
Oh,
very specifically only found in South Florida, which is part of what contributes to this really range restricted, critically imperiled ecosystem. Is like even our dominant tree species you can only find down here. And when you start to dig deeper into the understory vegetation, we have tons of endemics that can only be found in that system and that are all very fire dependent as well, just like the pine. So it makes for an interesting management challenge when you're surrounded by housing developments.
and what is the species of ibis? Is it just like a normal white ibis, or is it a different species?
The species that they're studying in Palm Beach County,
Yes.
or the well, the one that I shared about that ZooMiami was involved in removing those from the wild, that was the sacred ibis, which was an escapee, not from the zoo, but from a different facility, and is obviously not native to North America and was wreaking all sorts of havoc on the ecosystem. So that was one species. And then I mentioned the example right now of another researcher who's collaborating with the Palm Beach Zoo, who's studying white ibises in Palm Beach County to understand how they are adapting to living more urban lifestyles than their ancestors did.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the great questions.
I was wondering, where is the sacred ibis's normal range?
Yeah, really, really good question. The sacred ibis is native to, I know they're native to Africa. I'm not entirely sure what their range is in the continent, but also, somewhat water dependent, wetland dependent. So they had quite a field day when they found South Florida and all these great wetlands they could spread out into.
Sorry, I thought I was unmuted. Thank you.
No, all good. Thank you for the question.
Any other questions? Kathy, you have a question? Because we have a nice small group.
Yeah, sure. So we've heard stories about the gray-headed swamp hens that have spread throughout, that they were an accidental release from somewhere down in South Florida. Are you aware of any studies being done on those?
I'm not currently. It is another list that I have on my another species that I have on my long list of species that I would like to study, because I'm very interested in the swamp hens expansion in Florida. I can't say that I know of anybody who is currently researching them beyond just general population monitoring studies. I'm not sure if there's much more detailed studies than that right now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question about your research projects. Are you there 100% funded by the zoo, or do you have to go out and scrounge for research grants to fund them, or how's that work?
That's a great question, Jim. It's a combination. We're very fortunate that we have a county trust that funds most of our conservation and research department's work. That said, we still go out and write grants for a lot of these research projects anywhere that we can alleviate some of that budgetary strain and really make a stronger case for why it's valuable to have scientists on payroll at a zoo. It's always helpful. So we do also work with researchers and with other organizations and agencies to write grants to fund some of these projects as well. So the white crown pigeon work, for example, is primarily getting funded out of the county trust, but I am also actively writing grants to support that work. And certainly when it moves into what I hope will be the next phase, where we might be doing some tagging and telemetry work, I will be writing a lot more grants to support that work and collaborating with other organizations to do that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Nell and Regan? You missed the beginning where Steffanie said she's originally from Puerto Rico. But we've already decided that we should have a young birders trip to Puerto Rico. What do you guys think about that? You down for that, Nell and Reagan? And
Nell's
Steffanie
down.
volunteered to be our guide, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Can we go to Costa Rica in the same trip?
In the same trip might be a little tough, but if you want to go to Costa Rica anytime, let me know now. That is like a second home for me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a tough one. Costa Rica is
Yeah.
pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Puerto Rico, since it's technically still the U.S., but it could be a warm-up
Yeah,
trip for
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
Work out the kinks of traveling with young birders, you know.
yeah,
Mhm.
very fun.
But yeah, there's a lot of cool species there for sure, and having a bilingual guide would be very helpful, right?
Mhm.
That's, I don't know,
Yes.
Reagan, I don't think you or Nell speak Spanish, right?
A
No.
good time to learn.
Yes. Start working on that language skills, especially if you want to
Yes.
travel south of the border, of our border. That's cool. Well, one thing you should know if you're interested, and we'll put it out to our young birders, is Stephanie's going to come to visit the bird banding over in my area in Tampa, in Hammock Park in Dunedin, and then out on Caladesi. So if you want to meet her in person, get her autograph before she's on the Oprah show or something, you know, really famous. You know, so you'd have a chance to meet with her. I don't know if either of you are planning on coming to visit the banding on Sundays when we're in the hammock. So, so yeah, you get to, because I'm sure what usually happens, you can see these awesome programs, and then when you sign up, then you think of all your questions, right? But she has her email here. She's put it out there, so you can also contact her that way. So I'm going to stop recording.
Go ahead.